1, 2. So, okay, show of hands. Who was here last session? Okay, so thank you again for committing your time this morning to me and listening to some of the stuff we have been doing about identity appliances. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but I want to. This slide deck is designed to talk about identity appliance and give you a glimpse into why we chose to focus on this particular piece of work rather than just keeping doing the same old thing and adding more people and stuff as we're always doing. What we also want to do is be able to set the context for this as well. So for those the vast show of hands who were here before, you'll feel the same theme that's going through on this deck as well. We want to really introduce what Canadian Access Federation and CANARIE is doing is that they're working on 3 things with this federation, interfederation, and identity bit. Roaming wireless, as you heard about some of the updates in the last session, 60 countries worldwide, we have 48 sites in Canada, federated identity on the federated single sign-on, backed by Shibboleth or SAML protocol, and the interfederation activities using edugain as our foil or our bridge to the rest of the community internationally. You've seen some of these, this graph in the large a few minutes ago. 1.5 million logins. We doubled the traffic in 1 year. We have 50% of the universities in Canada with 48 sites, and we've seen a 40% growth in the number of sites using eduroam, and we want to see that continue. And the number of Canadian Access Federation users that we say we represent is just over 1 million. And so we use this number to say to other communities that we represent the number of users and the number of full-time equivalent students in the ecosystem so that we can give people a perspective on the community we work with. So we've added 24 service providers, and that's 160, we have 24 service providers, and we have a 160% increase in the last year alone on the number. We have 21 identity providers in this environment. The other thing about edugain, which people have heard me earlier, and you saw the value, is like you can build applications that are hosted elsewhere, and you can use your identity providers to get to them. And edugain is one of those places to get to. But at an international level, the INREN CEO Forum, primarily in Tirana, but also involves the rest of the, ironically, say, how often do you get to say the rest of the planet? All to say globally. We were an early adopter with only 8 countries in the edugain. Now there's 20. It's seen as that's the interfederation platform to go internationally and promote services and consumers.
Sorry, since I've never seen slide.
You do or do not?
Well,
excuse me, 1 second. Hit space. Oh, you know what? It's the animation. You're ahead of me.
Sorry.
Sorry, we have my avatar over here is doing the online version as well. There, now we're in sync.
Sorry.
So that's okay. This gives you an idea of the reach that we have, both domestically here in Canada, the span with 48 sites doing eduroam, 21 doing the IdPAAS, and the span at the edugain side of things internationally. And we expect to see this grow. And the reason it's 20 and not 60 is because the communities that are the earliest to adopt the edugain side of things are the ones that have mostly the maturity thing happens there. Not every country has its own federation, its own federated single sign-on environment, and some folks are just only focused on the eduroam side of things. So at CANARIE, we're very fortunate that we have a hand in both these trust fabrics. And what we noticed is that this difference was concerning to us. And so when we were looking at things, we said, well, that's great on eduroam. It's obvious that people want to have mobility. It's obvious that people want to have identity transit. But why is it the same for federated single sign-on? Why is there this gap being created? And as we're experiencing today with eduroam and the benefit of just being able to walk on campus and use your own credential, that network effect is not really being experienced by everyone else on the federated single sign-on. And so that's the web and the non-web side of things. And so what we've been doing is we talked to a number of new and old participants, we've talked to other federations, say, are you experiencing the same thing? And as I mentioned, there's not many other organizations that operate both eduroam and the Federated Single Sign-On. And actually what we're seeing is we're seeing convergence in that in the international community, particularly Internet 2, with eduroam coming under Internet 2. And in Australia, we're hearing that there's interest in how well can they work together. And so we took a look at over a year worth of data and saying, well, what are the barriers? What are the things that are going on with these? So what we realized is that the adoption rate was on the Federated Single Sign-On, the identity provider, was not, we saw a mismatch with what existing participants were doing and the way their staff structure was. And so what was happening in that next round or that next wave of adopters is that their IT staff are even more strapped. They have the same full-time equivalent count, and they have, if they have the same full-time equivalent count, but they have less staff, so they have a different reality and background of how can they execute. And so when you say, great, you joined Canadian Access Federation, we would like you to stand up this service. We know that they have limited time and attention. So we wanted to reduce the cost and effort to become a CAF participant. And we wanted to simplify the installation experience. So coming on board with eduroam there's less moving parts, but part of the reason it has less moving parts is because it has less information available to you. So with eduroam, all you're doing is validating a user ID and password. There's actually no extra pieces other than maybe a VLAN you're supposed to go on. And to an end user, that doesn't really mean anything to them. To the network admins, it does. But when you want to get extra attributes or you want to get extra information to make decisions about authorization instead of just authentication, it's a different experience. So there's some more moving parts there. So we wanted to simplify the installation experience, and we also wanted to reduce the day-to-day operations. So today, much of the community in the Federated Single Sign-On side of things, if you did not purchase a commercial platform, you would be in the model of repeating a recipe that would have you on the command line and working with XML files. You know, for most of the people in the room, you know, I would say that's not so bad. But when you start getting out into the field, when there's less attention and time to be able to familiarize yourself on that, the criteria of saying you shouldn't write bad XML such that it breaks that should not be a barrier, right? We want to make it easier. And in turn, easier day-to-day operations is also something of interest to us. Because as we add services, we don't want it to be very difficult to come on board. We just want the service to be available and easily accessed. So the regular approach, as I was talking about, for eduroam and the Shibboleth side of things, is to choose your server, choose your flavor, choose your poison, and on the server infrastructure you want to do. We don't necessarily prescribe choosing one, we prescribe the protocols. And using Radius as the protocol, you can choose Radiator, Microsoft NPS, you can choose Free Radius, and there's one or two other flavors, but those are the mainstays there. On the Shibboleth side of things, that's the Shibboleth software using SAML, and there's installation on your platform, could be Microsoft based, or it can be Unix based. And so, with the identity appliance approach, what we're saying is we're gonna have a pre-configured environment. We're gonna say where there's a supported server platform for the Radius side of things, and a supported platform for the Shibboleth side, Shibboleth software. It's going to come pre-configured, tested, and connected. That's a very important part to really ease the installation experience thing here. It's not about reducing functionality, it's all about the configuration. So as I mentioned before about the notion of there's not a lot of information available for identity or your extra pieces about who you are in Radius, in the Federated Single Sign-On experience, that's where you make data available to those services. And so configuring what your environment looks like, or your attributes, or your data, and how it's pronounced to the rest of the community is an important piece. And what we've seen is that it's pretty boilerplate. So what we said, let's make it easier. So we went through analyzing the solution. We looked at a ton of different things in the environment. And it's like Austin Powers colors here, but what we have is on the left-hand side is we have all the things that it should be. You know, I want the desired protocol support. I want to know that it's reliability and availability. I want monitoring and reporting. Those are the things it should be. And this is and really how it is and what it should do is more than 50% of the decision on this. This is when we were looking at how could we design a solution that would meet our needs. And we said, you know, the site operating effort to realize it is 21% of this 52%. So when you look at the site deploying and the site operational effort, those two together, 35% of the weighted decision on any solution, that's the rank of importance. And so what we were able to do with the scorecard approach is really evaluate a whole bunch of combinations and approaches to the problem space. And so we looked at open source everything, we looked at commercial services, we looked at on-site, off-site, we mixed and matched those kinds of things. And what we did is we used this as our guiding light on saying what should the solution look like.
Excuse me,
yes.
how do you come up with the elements of your scorecard? The left-hand side of the left-hand circle.
That's a really good question, and it took us a while to come up with those elements. We looked at what we wanted to do, and we said, here's the challenge. There's not what are the barriers to the remainder of the higher ed community to come on board on federated single sign-on. We looked at a technical level, and it was really a lot of the conversations with new people saying, what are your barriers? And also something for us internalizing. So things like, how could CANARIE expedite the ability to install things? And what is our effort? So some of these items are driven by us. We would like to have better reporting on things. That's how we got in over here. Scalability is important, but it wasn't, and some people may say, well, why is it such a small sliver? Because this environment already has addressed the scalability problem. There's that scale. So how we arrived to that set is a lot of introspection, community interviewing, as well as talking to our peers. So it was hard to come by, in short. And so it's quite exhaustive. There's a lot more points than this pie chart really relates, because there's a lot of sub-items. Does that help? Great. So on the aspects of the solution, I chose some of the pictures here to accent some of the things. And there's a lot of buttons and dials that you can turn and knobs to configure. So one of the things we looked at said, when a site comes to the Canadian Access Federation, they typically say, I just want one service. And they have one team do one service, and then a little while later and say, I really need the federated single sign-on. And then they have another team, and then they have another project, and then they have that go on. So why would you want two teams doing two different projects? Why don't you just have one team doing one project and have less time? That's one thing that we saw here. So we wanted to have a consolidated approach, and having it in one piece, one component, was a big thing for us. So you can have one kick to get everything in. It helps prevent the gap from widening. So that network effect, what we're experiencing, the benefits of having eduroam here, is the same experience that we want to have in the virtual world, because eduroam is really anchored by your physical location, whereas online, you're all over the internet, and you don't necessarily have the same spread of services available as you do in eduroam. So we want to have that same experience happen there. We want, as services come on with federated single sign-on, a good example is University of Toronto and Sheridan College. There's the department that's at the University of Toronto that's standing up a service that Sheridan's that is using. So they didn't have to worry, that department didn't have to worry, what, do I have to create user ID and passwords? They just say, I need to use federated single sign-on, it's done. Sheridan says I'm part of the Access Federation, done, and that service is available. So that department didn't really have to go through an IT analysis on what next to do with that service. They said, I'm just operating in an existing environment. And we want to have that be reduce that gap. The other thing it does is reduces barrier to entry. So would that department at University of Toronto even thought about that? Maybe, maybe not, not necessarily on their own. But as their services in globally in EduGain as well as US in Common have hundreds of services, and we're not isolated here on this North American continent. So we know we want to tap into EduCause, we want to tap into Desire to Learn, and Blackboard is also a service now in the Canadian Access Federation. So that shopping list of services is expanding. And so as someone's number 3 or number 4 on their list, I'm not going to get to those number 3s and 4 because my hair is on fire in the number 1s and 2 services to enable. But you know what? Those 3s and 4s could be someone else's number 1s. And so when they finish their number 1 item, let's say a learning management piece, then someone else in the Federation can use it. So you have people, you have amplifying your team. The other thing is about taking price off the table as you enable the service. One of the things we're very cognizant of is that as we look at identity management platforms and how either open source or closed source or vendor driven, there's different pricing models there. And so we purposely looked at, okay, well, Free Radius is the standard platform. It's an open source thing. It's a known configuration for eduroam. And Shibboleth is basically the de facto SAML 2 implementation for federated single sign-on. There's no encumbrances on per license. There's no encumbrances on per server for those particular software pieces. And so that's an important aspect. And it's not necessarily encumbered per user licenses. Let's say a directory services is, or your Active Directory has CAL licensing. So we're not encumbered by that. So points to anyone who can identify that engine? Yay! And you know it's not the hood, right? So under the hood, what does this look like? The identity appliance is a VM. It's based on CentOS, and it has the eduroam components installed and configured, Shibboleth components configured, and has a service management web interface and components there. And this is the extra piece. This extra piece here is the head for the appliance, and it allows configuration to occur through the web to the Shibboleth environment and some of the configuration to the eduroam environment. So it's pre-configured for Canadian Access Federation. It's connected, the Radius server is connected to the eduroam infrastructure. So we're not waiting for you to have your site admins do the connection configuration and exchange the shared secret and all this kind of stuff. We'll have that configuration done. And a bit about the pre-configuration part here. A lot of this, I've commented on the difference between Radius and Federated, eduroam, Radius, and Federated single sign-on and SAML. They're different because there's more information available. So mapping that schema or that user set, we're mapping to Active Directory, to the standard schema that's in Active Directory, so that that mapping doesn't have to happen over and over and over again. If you have extended attributes, not a problem. Usually what happens is there's a finite set of standard attributes exchanged. And part of this, we're applying our knowledge of not only the local stuff that happens here in Canada, but also with the community in the US, particularly some of the services we're really eyeing carefully, that we really want to have in our federation experience, as well as international. What do they need? And through EduGain. So there's a lot of conversation there about how many, and how slim a profile can we come out with. And so we've added our knowledge into there so that that's part of the pre-configuration. So how do you connect? So what happens is you connect with Canadian Access Federation, you talk to, I'll say, Harry up in the corner there. I'm looking for Peter, he's not in the room. Peter Willenius, our business development person. Connect with him. And once we go through the agreement and the trust assertion document, we start working through doing the VM. So we have a checklist of items that we've already done. So another thing that we saw in the simplifying the experience is people don't know what they don't know. I said, here's a Maserati, and I don't tell you when to do the oil changes, or I don't tell you that how to manage that vehicle. You don't know what you're supposed to do. You don't know. Maybe it's every 2,000 kilometers, you got to change the oil. Who knows? Here, what we want to be able to provide is the checklist and say, yes, you need all these things because you're going to be doing these things. And so we've done that pre-flight checklist, and that really helps eliminate things. And surprisingly, it's some of the basic pieces. It's firewall configurations. It's do you have the right privileged user to bind to the directory? Do you have that pre-configured? Have you talked to those people in your team? So you provision a blank VM, and this VM is a CentOS VM. It's about, I believe, 25 gigabytes of disk, 8 gigs of RAM, and 4 CPUs. We are working with folks who are typically deploying on VMware infrastructure. If you don't have VMware infrastructure, and that's the criteria that we have for that. And that criteria, the VM image, is already documented in the checklist. The identity appliance software is connected to remotely and securely installed, and the binaries and everything is laid down. And then it's on your infrastructure. You can choose to deploy this appliance in the cloud, like fully off your network. What we've seen and heard our community say is, I really want this on my network. I really want this here in my VM infrastructure. And it's securely connected to the directory, like it would normally have been done. So much of this is about pre-configuration, it's about connecting. It's also about monitoring. So this device will be monitored. So we can have remote monitoring. The alerts can be sent to wherever they need to be sent to, because you want to find out if there's a problem or a challenge before your customers or your students have a problem or your community has a problem. So there's monitoring in with it. The other thing I'd like to mention is that this is just a cloud here. So what we expect is that the system of record on your institution is doing what it's going to do. We're not prescribing anything there. And we're not prescribing anything about identity management processes either. We're really saying, as a result of your processes, you have a published view of identity data. And we just add the identity appliance as the mouthpiece for that identity data. So you have one location, one policy enforcement point saying, here's where this data goes out. So as I look around the room and see different institutions and different people who are, let's say, information security officers, who need to go through and do third-party assessments and say, how much data is over there? How much was released? How did it get there? You know, the who, what, the where's my data question. We're trying to simplify that route so that you have a single policy enforcement point for those places. It's not going to be the only one, but as you gravitate and consolidate towards a federated single sign-on model, your life in assessing what's out there, who's gone through what where, becomes a lot easier. We'll pre-connect it to Canadian Access Federation, so you don't necessarily have to figure out what is the right XML metadata. There will be information already in that checklist that will be pre-populated for it. It will also be connected to eduroam, and for those who did raise their hand about the previous presentation, being able to use cat.eduroam.org will be as simple as allowing SM attributes to be released. So it'll be connected in eduroam. And it'll be handed over to you. You have root, it's connected, and there's support available. As I mentioned before, the VM image can be hosted. There's a lot of dials and things we can do from an operations perspective. Hosted in your own private cloud. It's manageable via the web. Again, we're trying to reduce the complexity of management, not the functionality of it. It is fully functioning software for free radius and shibboleth. You can be as complex as you want it to be, as you need it to be, or as vanilla as you want it to be. And our hope is that the vanilla set is probably your default set that you'll be working with. As I mentioned, monitor with configurable alerts, and you have full control. You have it on your LAN. We've seen people who want to have it on their network rather than in the cloud. Instead of extending the perimeter of your concern to off your network, it would still be on your network. And there is support available. That's a piece as well. Because as staff change their roles and change their responsibilities in the organization, just because the person in whoever last touched it is usually the person who manages it, right? I mean, I see a few grins around the room. It's like, yeah. And no one wants to say I did it. So, because then you stuck it. Yes?
Related to that, what happens as people move between organizations? So say they go from UOT to shared. How does that transpire within this?
So can you be a little bit more specific? The question was, about people moving from one institution to another? And are you talking about students who have username and passwords, or are you talking about people who administer this?
I would say students, for example, or faculty.
Okay, so that's a good question, and that's what I wanted to sort of say, is it left or right there? And so it doesn't, in the identity appliance space here, it doesn't really address what to do about students who are mobile between institutions, who say, I cease to exist over here, which I'm just going to go, to answer your question, I'm going to go back a bit. Because that's a really good one, right? Because we're saying, whatever the IDM processes are about your life cycle around students, faculty, and admin, that's in here, right? That's not what we're addressing. What we're doing is we're saying, this is your mouthpiece for the truth as we know it, right? And so it's a little bit of a hand wave because everyone does it differently. So the follow-on to that is typically students don't necessarily cease in one and go to the other. They typically exist in both. Or this also gives you the freedom to say use that single credential in multiple institutions.
Chris,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure here we have quantum students coming here use their credentials to access our library. That's an example, right?
Yeah, so the library somewhere is cross-connected between the two institutions. So I don't know how they are cross-connected, but it's probably only for the library.
Yeah.
It's not at the web layer, it's not at wireless. So I think I've covered your question.
So,
Okay. And support available. And actually, that's where I'm at. And it's a brief presentation and introducing the identity appliance. And I welcome some questions. Yeah, great. What about patches updates for the identity appliance? Will you be providing those, and do you have an update schedule in mind? It's part of the support side of things, and it would flow in with the support. The schedule, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that one at this time, and really I think it would be driven as on demand as needed. Behind the scenes, there's a build environment with Puppet, and so there's ways to distribute that en masse and keep track of which ones are at different levels. I have wow. Okay, I have Jay first.
Chris, is there somewhere, or can you tell me who's in EduGain now?
In the EduGain, yes. If you go to edugain.org, you'll see the list, the site. And if you're looking for EduGain on the technical status, which is the interfederation stuff, right? So edugain.org/technical, I think. Right, I saw Peter.
Chris, thanks for the talk. In terms of high availability, is there a story there, and also costs of the?
Okay, so on high availability, there is a cluster configuration available, so it'd be multiple servers. And so details on precisely the high availability criteria, I think is really, we'd have to dig into what the criteria are, such as performance characteristics that you're seeking, which would drive how much HA on the platform. So if you need more than one server instance, which is not HA, it's a single instance, is there, but they can be clustered. And on the pricing, I think what I'm going to do is allow Harry to talk to it a bit.
Sure. It's going to be one-time install for $500, and then the optional support that Chris talked about is going to be $1,200 a year license, an optional package that institutions choose, and or may not choose to. We would recommend that they get the support because it's tough. So keeping the appliance up to date, and if there are any downtimes or they can take care of it. But yeah, so that's it. So $500 one time setup fee, and then $1,200 a year optional support.
And
Follow up on the high availability, it wasn't so much the load, it was for, we have a provider now, but the folks who run it are not comfortable that there's only one. And so it was about having two of them that would be the issue. Not really the.
So I think what you're really driving to is what kind of topologies would this be deployed in, such as what would be a standalone configuration, single node, a single node with hot standby, and then an active-active configuration. So all those flavors can be supported. The complexity increases to, if you're running active-active and stateful sharing, it is configured there. It relies on the Shibboleth software, which uses, I believe, at this time, Terracotta as the shared memory cache between them. But what I've seen others deploy in is non-shared, so stateless. So you go in, you authenticate, your assertion comes through, and it goes through. So you would have active-active, but not shared state. So that's a deployment decision, and about the number of nodes you'd like to deploy. You had a question?
Yeah, no, it was just back to the patching model. I'm assuming the underlying CentOS can be patched.
Yeah.
Regular. So it would really be changes to SHIB or eduroam itself, those pieces that would come from you as opposed to CentOS, which is regular distribution.
And so, any other questions? Eric. Or Eric.
I think I heard you say that it's handed over as a locally administered server once the provisioning is done. So does that give us the option to put an arbitrarily complex authorization scheme?
You can if you want. And where I think you may be going is probably additional authentication factors or an additional handler. So the group that we're working with actually has designed some additional authentication schemes. So two-factor authentication is
I was actually thinking about authorization.
authorization.
So.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sorry.
I feel like I was talking about this actually between sessions where both of us are looking at keeping our, for example, our local campus SSIDs, but we also have eduroam.
Right.
But in fact, by the time we're done, they will look the same. But for us, when you're an eduroam user at home, you have a role, which is undergrad, or you're a temporary camp, or you're a salaried employee, and you get a different service. And it's a different service gain for eduroam.
That's interesting. Okay.
So we hand back to the infrastructure, the access infrastructure, all kinds of information, such as VLAN ID to put you in, depending on what role you have. I'm going to take it further now. I actually intend to deploy the same infrastructure to support .1x wired for my resident. So I don't really want to run 5 radius servers. I really love to run one, throw all the interesting rules into it. And this is not to belittle what you're doing here. I think this has a lot of application. I'm just trying to figure out, can I bend this? Or how much do I have to work to bend this to reach into this kind of deployment? And I'm not sure.
So now I think I understand your question. So I think you're really going around the radius side of things, or the 802.1x space, and you're looking, saying, your question is, can I add in additional criteria or patterns to deploy an authentication answer with the extra VLAN stuff or additional different service levels that your equipment in the field will observe? Short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's a customization. So you turn it from configuration to customization, and it's free radius is the de facto reflection of the RFC for radius, and I wouldn't say it's vanilla. So there would be extra cost there, but that's definitely available. So you can be as complex and as sophisticated as you want, but along with that may come cost. And I'm sort of looking around the room. I know it's a shorter presentation, and that's okay. And I appreciate everyone's time. If there's no questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.